get started now? Okay, so why we're here tonight. Partly you know, because we have a president who stands up before a crowd a lot larger than this and points at a certain row in the crowd where we're guessing that the journalists sit, and he said the scum of the earth, the slime balls, they are the most dishonest human beings on earth. It wasn't until I became a politician that I realized how nasty, how mean, how vicious, how fake the press can be. He's blacklisted journalists. He's excluded entire news outlets at certain times. He's called journalists slimes and scum. He notoriously ridiculed the one journalist with a physical deformity. He calls them such lying, disgusting people. And he gave the game away in one interview with Leslie Stahl, a famous journalist, and he said, he told her, she asked, why do you keep doing that? Because it'd be one thing if he said these things one time, but he says them every week and every opportunity, time after time. And what he says is, you know why I do it. I do it to discredit you all and demean you all, so that when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you. So that's a part of the panelists are going to talk about that. They're going to talk about the damage he's doing to the press, the damage he's doing to democracy. But if that's all it was, then we wouldn't have a First Amendment panel. We'd have a Trump panel or impeach Trump panel. But as you're going to hear from the panelists, attacks on the press and problems, attempts to discredit the press have been with us in Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, back really even before the country began. You're going to hear about other ways that journalists are attacked. There's a pretty well-known case going right now with a young journalist named Amy Watkins, who was reporting on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and we've just learned that the Department of Justice secretly went in and grabbed her notes and grabbed her emails, because she was getting information from a staffer / boyfriend on the Senate Intelligence Committee. But that kind of thing must have a terribly dampening effect on working journalists, as we may hear. On the far end is Steve Rohde, our friend, who is a longtime ACLU high-level volunteer and leader. He's been president of the board and president of the foundation board. He's a well-known constitutional scholar, First Amendment right attorney, a writer, and an all-around good egg. Sonali, popular drive-time television and radio on Free Speech TV and Pacifica radio stations. We're so honored to come because you usually don't step out for these kind of events. And we're delighted that she did. And here is my boss, the publisher of the LA Progressive. She's Sharon Kyle, my wife. She's a law professor.
Look at that.
Well, I wanted to make sure I didn't say everything. But she's a law professor, and she's the publisher of LA Progressive, and she is a full-on racial justice advocate.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We thought this was a hot topic, but we didn't know what the weather would be like, so I'm grateful that you've come out here and joined us tonight. This is a very important topic. What we're doing tonight is taking one slice of the dismantling of democracy that the Trump administration is engaged in. And I'm hoping by the end of the evening we will have empowered you, reinforced you, inspired you to resist. I brought a 600-page book with me, Dissent, The History of an American Idea. And freedom of the press is deeply wrapped up in that concept. And what that book teaches is that we've had other dark chapters in American history. And it is only, and we've sometimes faltered in those eras, and we've been set back by those eras, but by and large we've taken 2 steps forward, but only because of we the people who have organized, who have resisted. And it's in that spirit that tonight's panel has been assembled with your connivance as co-conspirators in this effort. I was very moved shortly after the inauguration of the president by his attacks on freedom of the press. And much of what I'm talking about tonight, if you see me looking down, is an article I wrote on this for the Los Angeles Lawyer magazine, which is published by the Los Angeles County Bar Association, a rather mainstream organization, but they saw the necessity of an early warning on what was going on. I think we could probably organize a series of panels on each of the fundamental rights, as well as the rule of law and the protection of the courts and minority rights and women's rights. So that's why it's so important to spend a little deeper time on each one of these. Dick really alluded to it. Trump called journalists among the most dishonest human beings on earth, that they are the enemy of the American people, that the press is trying to take away our history and our heritage, and that on his first day in office, he called journalists among the most dishonest human beings on earth. So he has laid down the gauntlet on this, and what I wanted to do in speaking of freedom of the press is ground it in our history, and to introduce a slightly different take on the First Amendment and freedom of the press. Freedom of the press is not the icing on the cake of American constitutional democracy. Freedom of the press is an ingredient in the cake, an indispensable ingredient that makes that cake. And so fundamental it was to the founders. And the political thinkers who founded America designed a government to serve as a barrier against tyranny. And a word we need to use more and use in labeling Donald Trump is tyranny. They had experienced tyranny under King George III, and the history of European despots was well known to them. And they understood that a government based on popular sovereignty needed to guarantee fundamental rights, and that high among them was freedom of the press. Before we had a Declaration of Independence, one of my favorite founding fathers, George Mason, wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And he included, quote, "The freedom of the press is one of the great bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained but by despotic governments." So we know the broad outlines. The founders met in Philadelphia from May to September in 1787. Apparently it was in a chamber no cooler than this one. They hammered the windows closed to keep secrets. But even at that meeting, people like Charles Pinckney of South Carolina warned about a powerful executive. An executive might become a monarchy of the worst kind, to wit, an elective one. He understood that people could be prompted through fear and prejudice and hatred and bigotry to elect a monarch and to elect tyranny with it. So after that Constitutional Convention, where my friend George Mason refused to sign the Constitution, it didn't have a Bill of Rights. Mason said, "I'd sooner chop off this right hand than put it to a Constitution without a Bill of Rights." So he and others, then known as the Anti-Federalists, pushed for amendments to the Constitution, and that's how we got our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. James Madison was pivotal in that, and he called freedom of the press one of the choicest of the great rights of mankind. Now, freedom of the press is not some tepid right to be exercised at the deference of the president or any elected official. The freedom of the press is meant to be a robust and powerful right. According to constitutional scholar Leonard Levy, freedom of the press meant the right to criticize harshly the government, its officers, and its policies, as well as to comment on matters of public concern. By freedom of the press, the founders meant a right to engage in rasping, corrosive, and offensive discussions, foul-tempered and mean-spirited expressions. The very existence of personal liberties depended on the vigilance of the press in exposing unfairness, inequality, and injustice. And consequently, freedom of the press had become part of the matrix for the functioning of popular government and the protection of civil liberties. But the challenge, when all those documents were written and signed, the challenge was whether this grand design would work in practice. And the ink was barely dry on the First Amendment when the Adams administration passed and he signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, punishing aliens under the Alien Act and punishing sedition. The defamation of the government was a crime under that act. These are men who grew up, who lived the founding documents, and yet they faltered and violated them in adopting the Alien and Sedition Acts, under which many journalists were punished and sent to jail. It was a very political act. It expired on the last day of the Adams administration so that it couldn't be used by the Federalists when they came into office. But Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, pointedly reminded his audience that while the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, the minority possesses their equal rights, with equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppressive. He declared, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, and he swore that his administration would uphold those rights. The lesson overlooked by presidents since then, to their peril, was the Alien and Sedition Acts, designed as an expedient political measure, ultimately backfired. Federalists at all levels were rejected. The party soon ceased to exist. And in 1840, Congress repaid all fines levied under the Act, declaring that the Act had been a mistaken exercise of power. That only came because of the protest, the resistance, the opposition that came in reaction to that period of oppressive and authoritarian rule. We could come down with more examples, especially if we had more time. And it happens often with great presidents. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War. He and his administration sent journalists to jail who wrote pieces sympathetic to the Confederacy. We could come down to Woodrow Wilson and the first Red Scare of World War I, another Sedition Act and Espionage Act in which 2,000 dissenters were charged with disloyal, seditious, and incendiary speech and writing. And even a great jurist like Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis would uphold the convictions of Eugene Debs and others for opposing that war. So we know this happens at the best of times. We could devote a chapter to Nixon and the Pentagon Papers and how he had to be repudiated. And we even come down to our own time when during Barack Obama's administration, in addition to the much publicized indictment of Edward Snowden and the prosecution of Chelsea Manning, the Department of Justice brought charges against 6 others accused of leaking information to the media: Thomas Drake, Shema Leibowitz, Thomas Kim, Jeffrey Sterling, Donald Sachinben, and John Kiriakou. The point of those examples of Lincoln and Wilson and Obama is it does happen under every party and every administration. The ability to inflame fear and hatred is ever present, just barely below the surface. And that's why we have to be particularly cautious when it goes above the surface, when a president like the one we are experiencing right now. The history and the lessons of history tell us that we can resist those moments. We can overcome them. But freedom of the press and attacking and criticizing the press is only one of the characteristics of a fascist and authoritarian government. And as I close, listen chillingly to the 14 characteristics of fascism in a piece written in 2003, far before we could have dreamt of what we're facing now. So in addition to undermining the press, other characteristics that resonate ominously today are powerful and continuing nationalism, disdain for human rights, identification of enemies, scapegoats as a unifying force, supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, obsession with national security. Religion and government are intertwined. Corporate power is protected. Labor power is suppressed. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Obsession with crime and punishment. Fraudulent elections and rampant cronyism and corruption. We could have written that list yesterday for this administration. That is why this is a republic if we can keep it, and why knowing this history, identifying what's going on, organizing and resisting around it, that responsibility doesn't rest with a lovely panel on a warm evening. It rests with each one of you and your family and your friends and your colleagues as you go forth from this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for inviting me to this panel today. It helped that I live 5 minutes away, so. I have been a journalist for more than 16 years now, and it is a new phase in my career and the career of all journalists in this country since 2016, and actually since Trump started his campaign. A new phase that we find ourselves in. I was born and raised in an authoritarian country, the United Arab Emirates, where the message was sent very clearly to me and to children in general that you don't say bad things about the government, and journalists certainly can't speak their minds because you would get deported because the majority of the country is immigrant. And so I grew up understanding that journalists function in a different way in authoritarian regimes than they do in democracies. One of the wonderful things about coming to this country was your freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and that journalists do have greater rights. So it is, as Steve was saying, a hallmark of authoritarian governments when the press is attacked or when the press is suppressed or silenced or journalists are jailed and persecuted and prosecuted. And have felt this from a personal experience. And I thought the Obama years started to get bad with the aggressive prosecutions of whistleblowers and James Risen, who worked with Jeffrey Sterling, New York Times writer. But of course, we're in a whole new chapter today. Nothing is normal anymore. Everything is upended and everything is on its head. And of course, there's a very clear reason why journalists are attacked in authoritarian regimes, and that's because journalists have power, right? The reason the press is attacked is because the press has the power to expose. The press has the ability to expose the vulnerabilities. The press is Trump's worst enemy because Trump is the worst president we could have. The press wouldn't be such a threat to a president who was true to his or her values. And so that is why the press are such a target. And as he has admitted many times, he wants to discredit the press. And of course, the reason why we have this bizarre debate in our country today about what even constitutes news is thanks to Trump. And this is another aspect that is so worrisome and infuriating, and part of the attacks on journalism, that we can't even really agree as a country on what news is anymore. And often we find ourselves sharing things on social media or spreading certain ideas, and progressives and liberals are true of this as well, without vetting them, because we assume that if it comes from something that looks newsy or news-like or sounds newsy or news-like, it must be true. And of course we're immersed in fake stories all the time. And that too has become a threat to what journalism is and what media is by design. By Trump's design and by design of Fox News and the right-wing media. And that project started long before Trump. And I think one way for us to really understand and take stock of and frame this inability to distinguish real news from fake news is to understand fake news within a historical context and to stop calling it fake news and call it what it is: propaganda, right? Propaganda is a very old tactic. Propaganda is what dictators have used to get populations to bend to your will, to make them believe falsehoods, to amplify the crimes of scapegoats, and to whip up nationalism. And today, what is most fake news is simply propaganda. It is also, a lot of it, simply clickbait because of the corporate nature of news funding and the funding of journalism and the internet, the architecture of the internet. Those things were wrapped in and of themselves. But that too is part of the struggle for journalism and journalists, which is how we as a country have decided to fund journalism. This becomes part of the conversation, and we need to think about that. As someone who works on non-profit journalism, I see all around me what the corporate influence on media is and has been far before Trump, and especially now. Journalists are being, newsrooms have been downsized for decades. It's hard to find a job as a journalist. I'm one of the few people I know practicing journalism who has a stable union job in journalism with benefits that is almost unheard of today. Most of my journalism friends are freelancers who don't know where they're getting their healthcare benefits from. Some are living in cars and publishing in The Nation magazine, or some of these magazines you may be reading and you may not know that they've literally gotten paid maybe $200 for that extensive 2,000-word piece that they wrote. And that aspect of how journalism has developed as a vocation is part of the conversation around First Amendment attacks and the war on the media. When journalists are struggling just to have a living wage, you see them doing anything they possibly can, including doing PR work, including writing for journals that are simply producing clickbait. Many times I've thought about leaving KPFK for various reasons, and have explored the job market and found myself interviewing for clickbait websites that feed into the fake news narrative, or just sensationalizing news, and that's a problem. And so if we understand how to identify real news, if we understand how to better support journalists, we strengthen our institution of the media. And the definition of news is not just blurred because there's so much fake news, but in a good way, because who a journalist is now is not clear. And I think that it actually has been good for journalism. And what I mean by that is that journalists really are truth tellers. And because we have social media and the power of the internet, every single one of you can be a journalist today. The question is, what makes you a journalist is, are you a purveyor of propaganda or a truth teller? And if you're a truth teller, you're a citizen journalist. If you videotape an assault and post it to Facebook, you have just engaged in journalism and in the spreading of real information and the contributing to the truth. If you've accidentally passed on a piece of fake news, you've inadvertently become a purveyor of propaganda. And it's incumbent upon every single one of us to educate ourselves about media literacy. Media literacy is an old term. We used to talk about it a decade ago maybe, before the internet really required all of us to become proficient in the idea of media literacy. Check your sources before you pass on information, because when we spread fake news, we hurt journalism, we hurt journalists, we hurt the free press. The big challenge for journalists, for us as journalists, is understanding how to cover the times that we live in without playing into Trump's hands. He plays the corporate media especially like they were a toy. He whips up frenzies. I mean, just look at the way in which he announced a Supreme Court nominee on Monday. He built up all of this anticipation, talked about shortening the list, had these interviews with people, a parade of people walking through the White House that the media breathlessly speculated might be the next Supreme Court nominee. And then in prime time on Monday, in front of a televised audience, he made his grand announcement. And then it came out that he had known for months who he was going to pick. And this was all part of the charade. And this is the reality TV president that we are in. And reality TV presidents are very adept at playing the media. And so our challenge as journalists is to not play into Trump's hands, is to find the real stories, is to understand what the true stories are, to cover, to frame them with the history, and to bring that extra political context to. And unfortunately, too many people in corporate media aren't doing the job as good as they could for various reasons. They're being told by their editors, or they're just used to covering that kind of White House beat that encourages the breathless horse racing. It's really important for us also, I think, to understand finally how the idea of the First Amendment is being used as a cover for hate groups, hateful extremism. There is this false equivalency, right, made between the freedom of the press, the freedom of speech of all of us as individuals, and those who want to foment violence and who are literally called for violence. I know the ACLU has had, a national organization has had a very painful internal battle around what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, when the national organization backed the right of the Unite the Right rally to show up in Charlottesville, despite the fact that they were essentially, espousing hateful ideologies that threatened the existence of brown and black people. And then when the violence that ensued did so, and when one young woman was killed, it was an important moment for us as a country to understand what is free speech versus what is an incitement of violence. And if the person in Charlottesville who killed Heather Heyer is being prosecuted, which he is now, what about our very own president who has incited violence time and time again? And that is what he fears that journalists will hold him to account for. And that is why he continues to attack the media. So lots of things to think about, and I'll turn it over to Sharon, but I think that it's incumbent on all of us, journalists and non-journalists, to save the media, to save free press, to support it, to financially support it, to tell people about it, to be responsible about the news we consume and share, and to be ever vigilant. Thank you.
Many rallies that have gone on since we've had this terrible situation going on with the separation of families. And there was a young woman who appeared to be maybe in her 30s, and she appeared to be a white young woman. And she had a sign that she was holding that said, "If Hillary had won, I could be at brunch right now." And it was cute, and I understood, who wants to be out marching, who wants to have this awful situation happening with this separation of families. None of us do. But the truth of the matter is that the conditions that set up this Trump invasion have been long in the making. Dick said that this war on the media, that the United States, since actually before its inception, has always had problems with the media. Our First Amendment rights have been infringed upon since they existed. In fact, my ancestors weren't even protected by that First Amendment. So this is a constant. And there are some wonderful victorious stories, and there are some real sad stories. We're just in another place in time where we're fighting this continuous battle. And as the publisher of the LA Progressive, Dick and I have just celebrated our 10th year in March. He deserves a lot more applause than I do. Let me tell you, we have published every day for 10 years. Most times 5 articles. So, but doing that for 10 years really educated me in so many ways. Never have I been as informed as I am now. And that's completely as a result of editing, writing, interviewing. But it's also shown me how it is that we got to this day. This day was in the making. And until we, the people of the United States, not politicians, not the judicial branch, until we take our roles as citizens and as residents, until we take that seriously and understand the reins of power that we could have in our hands, we'll keep encountering this over and over. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about how essential the media is in arming and informing and protecting this democracy, and why it is it's called the fourth estate. It's the only industry that is mentioned in the Constitution. So beyond the executive and the legislative and the judicial, there is the fourth, and that's the media. And that should be in our hands, and it's time for all of us to participate. So that's all I'll say, and then Dick is going to move us on into questions.
Let me start with one on Steve, who ran through your LA Lawyer article, said it, which I read, and it's really insightful and a lot of details that he didn't have time to get to, which really showed that government repression of the free press has been going on in various ways and in various strengths for a long time. But Steve and I lived through the Nixon years and certainly the Obama years, and we were aware of the anger that was directed at the press and the ways to suppress it. But to me, what's going on with Trump is a whole new ballgame. And I wonder if you can tell us how you think, legally as a lawyer and as a concerned citizen, how do we defend our right to know the truth against such a ferocious onslaught as Trump is directing at it?
It's interesting to assess history when you're living it and not later by retrospection. To date, we have a lot of blustering, a lot of threats, and a lot of attacks. What I worry about is what is going on behind the scenes in the Justice Department and the movement toward indicting and going after journalists themselves. The examples we've talked about so far under the Obama administration most recently and Trump have been whistleblowers, the people supplying the information to the journalists. The next step under Sessions would be indicting journalists themselves. And in my piece and my research, there were several ominous predictions. Trevor Timm, executive director of the nonprofit Freedom of the Press Foundation, said that Obama has laid all the groundwork Trump needs for an unprecedented crackdown on the press. And others have warned that it's only one step to use the Espionage Act. That Espionage Act that I mentioned historically from World War I is still on the books. And when you consider the breadth of the language which speaks of anyone who brings disfavor upon and utters abusive language against the form of the government or the Constitution or the flag or the uniform. I mean, any Jeff Sessions appointed lawyer could write an indictment that initially could name journalists. So giving you that specific example in response to Dick's question is why eternal vigilance has to be with us at all times. We have to be alert to any of the signs with the same kind of protest. We may need a march for freedom of the press someday. We've had the Women's March, and we've had the March for Our Lives, and we've had the March for Separated Children. But on the first signal, the first public signal of actual action against the press, the readiness that we're prompting you to be part of today has to be unleashed. And that's why we have to be prepared enough. At my group, Interfaith Communities United for Justice and Peace, ICUJP, founded by George Regas of this beloved Pasadena community, we have a wonderful Catholic priest named Chris Ponette, and many years ago now, coined the phrase resistance at the water cooler. This was the metaphorical water cooler in most businesses that on Monday morning, or in your cases tomorrow morning, you may go to your place of work, or by extension to your families or friends or any gathering and say, I was at a panel last night, and I am very concerned about the attacks on freedom of the press, how this has happened historically, how authoritarian governments silence the press, and how we're moving in that direction. So that you begin to build a sense that freedom of the press is as much a call to action as are separated children or undocumented immigrants or each of the other assaults that Trump has engaged in. So I think it is a case. There's also Trump's promise. He makes promises to modify the libel laws. He wants the press to be sued for defamation, despite the fact that the United States Supreme Court has largely protected the press in that area by only allowing libel suits against knowing or reckless falsehoods. So whether he keeps that promise remains to be seen. But each one of these is the kind of assault that we're wanting you to raise your antenna, raise your sense of it. Look for opportunities to write letters to the editor, to talk to your elected officials at the first glimmer of these threats to journalists and to the press. Those are the kinds of things I know we'll even be talking more about later on.
Actually, can I add to that? Just one quick thing to add. There was a story in April that didn't get much traction or attention. It was first pointed out by Forbes that the Department of Homeland Security was seeking business services to hire a contractor that would create a searchable database of social media influencers, journalists, and media outlets. So, of course, a good first step to attack journalists is to keep a list. And so that is something that's already in the works.
So just as Sonali did, I encourage the three of you to ask each other questions or tag on. So Sonali, you pointed out at least several problems that current day journalists face. For one thing, so many of them have lost their full-time jobs, so many of them moved to freelancer status or out of the business altogether, struggling to make a living at it. And then we have a largely supine mainstream media that plays an old game, shows up to Trump's rallies and reports it like it's Lyndon Baines Johnson, and only has recently started calling out the lies, and not very strongly said we might be wrong. And then we have this tradition of fair and balanced. So I wondered if you could talk about how the difference between taking a well thought out political position as opposed to just flat out lying.
I mean, this is a very old debate within journalism, right, about the difference between advocacy journalism, as it's sometimes called derisively by corporate media, and balanced journalism or objective journalism, because there is a myth among journalists that one can be truly objective. But if you go to journalism school, and I didn't, you find out that there are certain rules about how you report on things, including giving extra weight to people in power. It's just built into the training that journalists receive, and it takes work to undo that training. And after many years, sometimes people working in corporate media start to see how they feed into the existing problems and the status quo. And you know, when I get accused of being an advocacy journalist these days, I take it as a compliment, because I am advocating for the people. I am advocating for truth. I'm advocating for the ordinary American or immigrant. I'm advocating for the powerless against the powerful. And if that's advocacy journalism, hell yes, so be it, right? So I think that's a way in which we can, as journalists, understand how to cover stories. If you are unaware or refusing to highlight the power imbalance between forces when you report on those forces, you are part of the problem. As Howard Zinn said, you can't be neutral on a moving train. You know, the reporting around Israel and Palestine is such a classic example of how mainstream media has for years and years and years tried to report this in a balanced manner, which means giving equal weight to the incredibly well-armed colonialist nation and the poor, struggling, oppressed Palestinian, as if those were two equal sides, and we know that they're not. So that I think there are so many examples that we could look back and see the way in which mainstream media has done a major disservice to many issues and events. And it's always been those of us from the sidelines, sometimes dismissed as fringe journalists or fringe radical media or advocacy journalists, that push the mainstream into being forced to report on the truth. The tide, little by little, is changing on the issue of Israel and Palestine. When Natalie Portman says that she can't be part of something, you know, an ardent Zionist is troubled by Israel's treatment of Gaza, the border. She's obviously reading some sources of information that are getting out there. And so, you know, the U.S. media coverage on Venezuela has been incredibly irresponsible, like shockingly so. Cuba, we know that. There's histories there where you see a very stark difference between how mainstream media reports on certain things versus how independent reporters report on things. And often it's those of us who are more independent that push mainstream journalists, sometimes having to shame them into covering things. So there's all these internal dynamics within the industry itself, so much of it having to do with funding, power, proximity to corporate power, proximity to political power. I mean, there are people in Washington who call themselves journalists, but who will not burn a bridge at the White House because they would lose their source, and who essentially become stenographers for anonymous leakers because they get the front page stories, but essentially all they're doing is being conduits for the kind of, you know, placement of stories that serve power. I mean, so many of the revelations in the news media over the past year and a half have probably been from Trump's own team, who's been kind of, and then Trump will of course turn around and respond, you know, angrily about the leakers that are going to be prosecuted, and later it'll come out that it was somebody close to Trump that essentially leaked it, or it's hypothesized that it could only have been him or close to him or on his orders. So we really do have to, as journalists, hold each other accountable. I don't know if I answered your question on that, but I would try to do it.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in a little bit on that, on the advocacy journalism part, and the way that it's almost, in some circles, it's sort of become a pejorative for when you hear that someone uses advocacy journalism. But I went to a talk that was given by Marty Kaplan, and those of you who know Marty Kaplan or don't know Marty Kaplan, he is the director of the USC Annenberg School, the Tom Lear Center at USC Annenberg School of Media. And Marty Kaplan talked about the ways in which Americans are informed politically. You know, how is it that, you know, that certain people get their information from Fox News, or certain people get their information, where do they get their information from? So USC conducted a study, and they looked at about 8 different stations here in Southern California. They did a study here in Southern California, and they found that 78% of the people that live within Southern California get their news or are informed from local news. I'm talking not international news, not national news. I'm talking like KABC, the 30-minute local news shows. Yeah. And I mean, that was so surprising to me that 78% of people admitted that that's how they are informed. And then he broke down, well, what is it that they're getting from the local news? And he found that the local news provided them with, well, first of all, it's not 30 minutes, it's 22 minutes. You know, like, you give us 22 minutes, we'll give you the world. Because 8 of the 30 minutes are used for commercials. So once you deduct the 8 minutes for the commercials, you got 22 minutes left. Then he found sports and weather, crime stories, odd miscellaneous stories like the lady found a bear in a pool, and entertainment Hollywood. That took up more than half of the remaining 22 minutes. Something like 12 minutes was devoted to those 4 areas of news. The remaining 10, 11 minutes, there was 1 minute for business and economy, another full minute devoted to catastrophes, natural and otherwise, another full minute, of course, for traffic. It got to the point when he finally started talking about politics. The average person in Southern California gets 22 seconds. 22 seconds for something that, of course, we all know has a huge impact on our lives. So, and what we're talking about here is mainstream media. So these news outlets, of which there are 700 news outlets across the United States, these news outlets, he went on to talk about, well, where do these news outlets get their stories? They get their stories, it starts with print media, and now the internet, because the LA Times and all of the newspapers across the country, those that are still alive, they are now publishing online. So it starts there, and then the local stations pick it up, and they do very little actual real reporting, obviously, if they're only going to do 22 minutes. So the problem that I'm highlighting here is, first of all, they cast aspersions on advocacy journalism, but then if you look at what mainstream media is actually reporting, it's very understandable how we ended up in Iraq. If you remember, do you guys remember Judith Miller? She was a New York Times reporter, and she got nailed because she didn't do her job, but none of them did. As we marched our way, because of these weapons of mass destruction that mainstream media did no investigative journalism on, we ended up there, and in some respects are still there. Some, I don't know how many years later, 17 years later. Because we have this elite league of people that belong to the elite club of mainstream media. They cast aspersions on independent news like the wonderful work that Sonali does, the work that is done by The Nation, Mother Jones, Democracy Now!, Tom Hartman. All of these kinds of outlets are looked down upon and considered radical. But had you been paying attention to those outlets, you would have known that we should not have gone into Iraq. So I don't remember exactly what your point is, because I'm kind of getting lost. But I do want to make one big distinction between mainstream media and independent media, and that's the economics. So even though someone like Judith Miller may have wanted to push a little harder, they're unwilling to compromise because they're getting the big bucks. And independent media, like Sonali pointed out, there are people that write for The Nation magazine and only get $200 for a story. And I know how much the LA Progressive gets. And believe me, 200 will make me happy. So we as a people, the nation, we have to take on our responsibility for funding the kind of information that we want. So, Steve.
So we're going to take a pledge break for KPFK. No, I'm joking, but as much as we cringe, and Sonali cringes because that's less journalism, it's important. I mean, that's why you support independent journalism, and we all should be doing that. I just want to check off a couple thoughts in reaction to everything that's been said. Many of you will remember a wonderful New York Senator, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and I often regret he's not with us now. He said something so powerful on this first question, Fox News, etc. Moynihan said, "Everyone is entitled to their own opinion. Everyone is not entitled to their own facts." You're entitled to your opinion. You can't have your own facts. And half of the challenge of all of this journalism is marking that, identifying that. This is commentary. This is an editorial. This is a news story. And this is going back to Roger Ailes and deeper into right-wing media, is the blurring of all that so that an audience doesn't make those distinctions, takes opinions as fact, and then goes about making their choices as voters and citizens and the rest with that confusion. Another name that came to mind tonight was Dan Rather, and we talked about the run-up to Iraq. I don't know if you remember, within days of 9/11, Dan Rather, I believe at the time still a prestigious CBS anchor, went on David Letterman and looked in the camera and said, "Mr. President, reporting for service." Mr. President, reporting for service. A journalist. Talk about blurring. Talk about missing the point. What we needed in the wake of 9/11 and have needed for the 16 years is not reporting for service to your government, but being an independent journalist, which and then that was 9/11, and we got Afghanistan, Iraq, and everything since. And the last comment is Judith Miller. Judith Miller went to jail for the wrong reasons. Judith Miller went to jail protecting her sources for one of her news pieces. What she should have gone to jail for was being the stenographer of the White House, tailoring White House press releases from Dick Cheney into New York Times front page stories, which then influenced public opinion. So in that sense, she has a lot to be held accountable for.
And much as I love to hate on the corporate media, I also want to remind us that there are, broadly speaking, three categories of media. We have the independent press, of which I'm a proud member. We have the corporate press, and then we have propaganda outlets masquerading as media, right? And it is critical for us to identify those as not media outlets. And Fox News began that, Rush Limbaugh began that, Breitbart has carried that on into the internet age and have multiplied into armies of what are essentially no more than racist trolls that masquerade as newsmakers and propagandists, and they are having such a real impact on the country. We probably all know somebody in our life, in our family, who primarily because they consume a steady diet of this propaganda, have become an angry person and have become a Trump supporter. My stepfather-in-law is one such person. I was just talking to a friend who said, my father used to be a nice person. He was kind of a cheerful guy. And now he's angry all the time because he watches Fox News. There's this great documentary, The Brainwashing of My Dad. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's a fantastic film where this woman chronicled the very clear change she observed in her father's personality and politics when he began consuming this propaganda, which is what has in part given us Trump and what has now become his, his bullhorn. And we have to keep calling that out. We don't see enough in the corporate media taking on Fox News, shaming Fox News as not a real news outlet, Breitbart, etc. They need to do a better job of that. We have great organizations like Media Matters for America that watch Fox News so you don't have to, and that basically expose them for what they are, which is a propaganda outlet. And that is a very, very serious thing, because that literally is converting the minds of gullible Americans and turning them into part of Trump's army of incredibly, frothing at the mouth scapegoaters, and it's got to stop somehow.
Okay, so we'll start mixing in some audience questions.
As a oft-used quote, that the freedom of the press works for you only if you own one. The elephant in the room that we seem to have missed is the consolidation of media that's led directly to what you said. We haven't mentioned Sinclair, which is a pure propaganda outlet. Yes, Sinclair, you did. That's right, you did. But when Bill Clinton, you called out Obama, let's call out Mr. Clinton as well. When he signed the Telecommunication Act, he directly led to the Sinclair consolidation, so that we have, although we have 700 outlets, the major news outlets really are only represented by, 4 or 6 entities. And if your system is based, as the mainstream media is, on a capitalist outcome, you're going to get news that benefits those people who own those papers. So what would you say that we could do as people, the dissent, to prevent this consolidation that began 3 administrations ago.
When Bill Clinton signed that, the internet didn't have as much of a presence as it does now. And I think, that there are some things that we can do orchestrated as a group, as a collective, and there are some things that happen organically. And one thing that has happened organically is as the concentration of media has gotten into a smaller and smaller bunch of people, very rich people, corporations now. I think now it's only 5 corporations in total that own all media. As that has happened, all except for independent media, as that has happened, social media, independent online media outlets have grown exponentially. And in fact, I want to talk a little bit about alternative media, because alternative media is getting to a place where it is servicing more people in the United States than mainstream media. A recent Pew Research study was done, and it found that 72% of Americans consume some form of media via the internet. They may be subscribers, and the study didn't indicate the names of the outlets that they choose, but this is happening organically and filling a gap, which is why the whole net neutrality thing is so important, because human beings find a way to make a way. Now, a few years ago, everybody knows the name Trayvon Martin. Well, Trayvon Martin's name would not be as well known as it is had it not been for the technology. So as technology advances, we will find ways to use it. And sadly, alternative media was also the springboard that launched the widespread story of Emmett Till. Emmett Till, who in the 1950s was the young man who lived in Chicago. He was actually a boy and went to the South to visit his parents' family, and he was, a mob lynched him for, allegedly because he whistled at a white woman. Well, alternative media, Jet Magazine, so the black community in the United States has always had alternative media. Mainstream media has never served us. It doesn't serve us today, and it didn't serve us 50 years ago, and it certainly didn't serve us 200 years ago. So we've been here, we live here, we know this story, but we find a way. And each of those events, Trayvon Martin, as a result of that launched the Black Lives Matter movement, which is now impacting policy. Same thing with Trayvon Martin. That launched the Civil Rights Movement, which changed all kinds of policies in the United States. And before that, in the 1880s, Ida B. Wells, it was 20 years after slavery was abolished, and Ida B. Wells bought a ticket on a train, a first-class ticket on a train, because back in those days, this was the way that they were resisting. The they that I'm talking about were the recently freed slaves who had been told you are free, and it was, okay, we're going to see how free we are. So they would buy a first-class ticket. And she bought a first-class ticket on a train. She gets on the train, and when she goes to sit down, there's a man smoking, there's another man on the train who's drunk, and she was very uncomfortable in this car. So she decided that she wanted to go in the ladies. They had a special car for ladies, which, by the way, Dick and I just took a trip to Japan, and on their trains, they have a ladies-only car.
So does India.
Oh, India has them too? I've never seen that before. I said, oh, great, Dick. See you later. No, I didn't. So she gets on the ladies' car, and the conductor would not allow her to ride. And he pulls her off the train, he rips her clothes, and she was determined that she was going to write. This is one of her first stories she wrote, the story that she wrote about how she was thrown off this train. And this led Ida B. Wells to establish a long career as a resistance journalist. She was an advocacy journalist for what was happening with the formerly enslaved people and the new, Jim Crow, which was new back then. new laws that did not exist before slavery. All these new laws were enacted to essentially return black people to slavery. And so, as a result of that, the work that she did actually forced mainstream media to start to look at lynching. So there's always a way. And that's all I say. So what I wanted to talk about was the organic way. And Steve might want to say what.
Right.
Oh, I just wanted to address the question that you put forward about media consolidation, which is a really critical one. That, you know, there has been for many years a media reform movement. There used to be conferences that the organization Free Press put on to address this very thing about the consolidation, increasing consolidation of media, and you know, Ben Bagdikian's famous works, and every new edition that he came out with his book about media consolidation, there were fewer and fewer companies buying up more and more media. And I think I just want to bring up this point that yes, of course, please financially support independent media, donate to KPFT, spread and all of that. But it is an interesting thing that mainstream media outlets are now realizing that those models that Pacifica had pioneered years ago, which is that of subscription, might be the more sustainable and stable source of funding. So you have the New York Times right now making money hand over fist through subscriptions, where you get a large number of people paying a small amount of money directly for the media they consume. And that can give even a paper like the Times some measure of independence from its corporate sponsors. But we do need to reimagine another funding source and funding structure for media. Just as we have our ideal for how we want to see healthcare in this country turn into a single-payer system or Medicare for all, we need something to aspire to in terms of the funding of media that we don't yet have. And there are examples in other countries. You know, a fraction of our bloated military budget could fund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, that could disseminate much more money than it does now, and could free journalists to do, you know, first of all, enable them to make a living wage and free outlets from corporate sponsorship and enable them to be more independent. And of course, this country has long fought the idea of government funding for the media because that's seen as a hallmark of a socialist, a dictatorship. But socialism is becoming more and more popular these days. The idea of socialism, particularly among millennials who can't make enough money to pay off their college debts or get a decent job, are understanding that they would rather our taxpayer dollars go towards actually us as opposed to the weapons manufacturers. And so we do need to imagine or try to envision some sort of either subsidized journalism or government funding that is strings-free and that is based entirely on whether you are actually doing your job as a journalist as opposed to reporting on this, that, or the other. I mean, Britain has a very good example of the BBC, which has for years produced, not just awesome TV shows, but really great journalism that continues till today. So we need to start thinking of our funding our media in those ways.
If I can add just in direct response to your question, we used to have something in this country called antitrust laws.
Yes, we did.
And if you ever needed another reason to take back Congress and take back the presidency and take back the appointment of an attorney general and the reinvigoration of antitrust laws, so long as we avoid censorship in the area of the media, media is a business, and media consolidation can be addressed by antitrust laws, which would further all of the interests we've been talking about.
Well, I've been hearing a lot of great ideas about funding the media and sending antitrust laws after them and everything. In my mind, this comes down to only one thing. We have to vote. We're not voting. The election in New York, where, a 10-term congressman got defeated, only 5% of the registered voters voted. Every vote counts. And we're not going to get any of the things you're talking about if we don't get different majorities in Congress.
I'm part of the generation that comes right in between Generation X and the millennial generation, so I see how my generation interacts with other people, where they get their news. It's exactly what you guys are saying. And actually the reason that I got rid of my TV about 12 years ago was because I was just disgusted with local news and advertising commercials. It was just driving me nuts. But when I try to have conversations with people, so for me, well, let me back up. I surround myself with like-minded people. Obviously, I come to meetings like this. I try to support organizations of people who agree with me. My big thing, especially because I feel so passionately about these issues, that when I am talking to someone who does not agree with me, or who's so right-wing, I get very emotional. It's very hard for me to stay focused, to articulate exactly what I'm trying to say, and especially if I'm talking to other people of my generation, or just any people of any generation who are not exposed to the right media outlets. They have no foundation, no basis for what I'm saying. And if I try to go into all the nuances and all the complexities of the system and what's leading up to this dictatorship and this authoritarian environment, their eyes start to glaze over. And I do things for me. I read conservative news sometimes. I literally just want to throw my laptop. But I force myself to read it just to expose myself to it, just to try and figure out arguments. But I'm still, when I'm one-on-one, the reason I come to meetings like this is because I want to basically have, as simple as you can possibly get, talking points to introduce someone on the other side to exactly what I am seeing. Because when they read conservative news, they're just convinced. When I'm reading conservative news, I'm seeing the dark side to it. I see how you're trying to skew something, but that's just my perspective, and that's just because I've exposed myself to other media outlets. So do you guys have any just basic as you can get, just to introduce them? Because if you get too complex, I have found conversation after conversation, I get frustrated, they lose interest, they have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, or they just completely, they're saying, oh, you're reading fake news. So first, talking points on how to identify, exactly as you said, what propaganda outlets are in a way that can kind of convince, or at least shed light to conservatives and crazy right-wing nut jobs, to even just very intelligent people, but they happen to be very, very conservative. So identifying propaganda outlets, and then secondly, it's not, what I try to explain to people, it's not what you take one step and suddenly we're in this authoritarian government. It is little by little by little, but trying to break that down again for someone on the other side, and I hate to say on the other side, because we are all part of the same country, and we're all fighting for the rights of everyone else. So do you guys have just talking points to articulate both points? Just how you get to this point, and how we can identify these propaganda outlets?
I want to answer this question, but it's not an easy answer. Do you have an easy answer for her?
I'm sure I'll have something additional to say.
Okay. So one of the things that's fantastic about the internet is that the amount of information that's out there is just, I mean, there's more and more all the time. It's just unlimited. And there's a story about some right-wing nonsense. Not only can I set up my own feed, but Google establishes algorithms that makes suggestions for me when I'm doing a search for information. It says, oh, there's Sharon. We know. She's progressive. She's a black woman. She's an advocate for this issue and that issue. Here are some things that she's probably going to want to read. And here's some stuff that we would never show her. And they're doing the same thing for other people. So while I say that is extremely problematic, and the polarization clearly is getting worse, and this is contributing, it's a major contributing factor, the only way that I know of to combat it is really to work to fix the entire system. And that is what this young lady said about voting, about becoming civically engaged. Because then you can affect policy, and policy can perhaps change some of the things that technology is driving right now. That's just one way, but my way is not an easy way. It's a long-term commitment. It's about taking your responsibility, your civic responsibility, serious, and getting engaged and making change that way.
I'd like to address that question, and I'm so glad you brought up the Google filter, by the way. We didn't even get to this, but that is yet another attack on journalism. To have these big corporations create bots to pre-filter everything you see is an incredibly dangerous thing. Facebook does it, they all do it. We need to fight back against that. I think for you, when you're talking to somebody who's a crazy right-wing nut job, first of all, ask yourself if it's worth changing their mind, the effort that it's going to take you to change their minds. Because if that person that you're talking to is going to pull a Kellyanne Conway on you about alternative facts, and you and that person cannot even agree what facts are, then they are in lost cause. If you can agree on what facts are, if you can agree that there is such a thing as, somewhat objective truth, just verifying facts, then there are some very great, trustworthy places on the internet that you can ask them, challenge them. All right, tell me a claim that you think is true that sounds, might sound crazy to me. Let's look it up on Snopes.com. Let's look it up on PolitiFact.com. Snopes is an amazing outlet. I use it for my journalism. If I see something on someone's Facebook page, and they have some problems, they have some certain issues here and there. They've been called out, but by and large, I would say 99% of what they cover is very good. And if I see something that comes across my Facebook page that sounds totally ludicrous, Snopes, S-N-O-P-E-S, Snopes.com, I will often look it up on Snopes. Before I report it, because that's critical, and they will, tell you if it's true, false, or a mixture. And that's one way you could talk to somebody. All right, throw out a fact that in your mind is a fact that is a reason why I should be voting for Trump. Let's look up whether this is actually real. And, that could, and if they decide that, no, I'm not, no, those are your facts, and I've got my facts, walk away. Just walk away.
This is such an important question. I want to offer a counter point to what's been said so far. Some of you may know the work of George Lakoff, who's a linguist and more becoming a political analyst. If George were here, he would say that anyone who has talked about facts in the context of your question is missing the point. It's about emotions, it's about stories, it's about narratives. So, to your hypothetical crazy brother-in-law at your Labor Day picnic, or any context we want to create, you've got to tease out what could move them emotionally, or your crazy mother-in-law. And you might talk about children. And the unthinkable image or reality of a child being separated from their mother or their parents. And then you dig deep into what's going on currently. Or you talk about immigrants, including their grandfather or grandmother who came to this country, and build that narrative, that storytelling, the emotions that are attached to that, and then you contrast what Trump is doing in all of his policies to destroy that. I think it is so important what you've raised. I think we cannot just be in an echo chamber in this next period for the midterms and even next year, in 2 years. Look up last Sunday's Doonesbury. The panels were a canvasser in what appeared to be a coffee shop, having these strangers agree on the facts and what Trump is doing in each of the examples that he could fit in 3 panels. The second to the last panel is, we understand, but we're supporting Trump. And she says, I spent an hour and a half talking to you. And they say, we're sorry. So look it up. It's better done than I've told you. I do think we have to talk to the crazies, to the uncle, the friend, your stepfather-in-law. It is going to be that middle. It's going to be so-called moderates, so-called people in the center, if we're going to move those few percentage points that we need in electoral politics. And I think, and you can talk about abortion today, and going back to coat hangers and back alleys, if this Supreme Court Justice lives out the promise I think he's made to his right-wing sponsors.
I'm sorry, 2 quick comments and 1 question. The first is that the notion of mainstream media as a term is preposterous. The left calls the right mainstream media, the right calls the left mainstream media. Whenever I hear this in conversation, my head explodes. Secondly, the notion of citizen journalists is troubling to me because the technology suddenly made it easier for all of you to be plumbers. I don't want to see all my neighbors walking around with plungers, asking me if they want to fix my toilet. It's a fine art. Leave it to them. I was thinking that as a journalist, I don't want to see my neighbor lugging a typewriter around. That's just me. And this is an inside baseball question for you, Sonali. I had read somewhere that some press organizations had agreed to no longer cover Trump rallies. They're simply propaganda. Had you heard anything about this?
I don't have a problem, or I don't feel threatened by the notion of citizen journalism. And today you can look up on YouTube how to fix a toilet, and more power to you. And you can be an amateur plumber, much more so than you could before. I've learned how to crochet on YouTube. And I think, I mean, I know what you're saying, though, that there are certain things that we train ourselves to do as journalists that we think ordinary Americans aren't thinking about when they're writing or framing or blogging or writing a social media post. But I think that we underestimate most smart thinking individuals. I have seen many people around me who are not journalists who could very well be journalists in how they see the world and analyze it and convey information. So I stand by wanting to see more citizen journalism. But to your question about, and your question was about not covering rallies. I haven't heard that, and I think if they did that, that would be great. But see, I'm not for not covering a rally. I actually like the idea of covering a Trump rally, but cover it in the right way, expose them. If there's a group of 5 people who showed up for gun rights, point out the whole article should be about the ludicrousness and the patheticness of a small turnout. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is a lot of corporate media will amplify. Oh, there was when the Tea Party movement first happened, any tiny gathering of 5 people on a street corner was amplified into a massive. There'd be like tens of thousands of people on the left marching, and they would barely get a small line in the media. And so we just need to cover these things responsibly. Not to just say we're not going to cover them, cover them responsibly. I don't know. That's my take.
I'm in the millennial generation, and we are the most apathetic group, partly because of what we talked about with mainstream media, corporate media, as you call it. So my question is more so speaking to this young lady's topic about voting, but for me, it's how do we, myself, anyone, actively engage my group? I find it I'm personally here for a class, but but I also don't know that I typed in, I was searching, and that's how I found it, on Eventbrite. But I didn't know these things that are going on. Granted, I don't live in Pasadena, so that could be why. But how do we engage the millennial generation to be more civic-minded so that we do go out and vote? Because Obama engaged us, so we voted, but then it's
That's a simple one. We'll just assign more classes.
The best way I know to engage your generation is to do it online, to share, to do Instagram, to do Pinterest, to do Twitter. You could have sent 1,000 invitations to this thing tonight to your friends. You got your network, right? You got your address book. You know how to contact them for other stuff.
Yeah.
Same way.
And we need inspiring candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Even though there was a small voter turnout, we need inspiring candidates. Like on a local level, Obama's on the local level, but much more left than Obama.
I think the apathy may derive from a sense of comfort, of not feeling attacked or in jeopardy. So it's my same litany. What if you or someone you knew wanted to terminate a pregnancy and the law did not allow that? What matters in your real life, your health care, your education, your housing, and the housing of your friend and the friend of your friend who is homeless? And again, bringing it back to those basics. No one else of another generation is going to take care of this for you. And then we have a responsibility to inspire your generation to understand all of that and therefore become active.
And one thing about Snopes is that the standard response from Trumpinistas to anything when you tell them to check on Snopes is that it's been bought by George Soros. So, I mean, that's like a no-starter. I mean, everybody ever mentioned that, would they go, oh, that's George Soros, he owns that, you know. I'm still waiting for my money for protesting from George Soros. I don't know about the rest of you, but I haven't gotten my check yet. I think the other thing, though, I think one thing that I realized in having a conversation with a friend of mine who's not necessarily a Trumpinista, but is a Hillary would-have-been-worse person, and she said, Hillary's a criminal. I said, well, if you're going to allege that someone's a criminal, you have to say, I said, what is the crime she committed? Well, she's just a criminal. I said, well, you can't say that. I mean, somebody is a rapist, a murderer, a thief, but you can't just say they're a criminal and not be able to name the crime. So we got into this sort of conversation, and I never realized just how dense she was when it comes to this, totally politically ignorant. I mean, really didn't know any of the actors going on right now, nothing, not a single thing. And then she said, she got very upset with me and said, well, you just think you know more than I do. And I had to bite my tongue. I really wanted to say, no, I know I know. No, that's not good. But anyway, we sort of agreed to disagree, but this light came on after a few minutes of trying to discuss something rationally with her, because then when I said, what crime did Hillary commit? She says, well, there's Muslims in France. And I'm like, oh my God, really? But anyway, so what happened is it occurred to me that one of the problems that I think that we're facing with a lot of these people is they really think that their strongly held beliefs are fact. And trying to get them to distinguish between their beliefs and their opinions and fact is next to impossible, when they're that deeply entrenched. So I'm just wondering if you guys have any ideas.
So having a movement against right-wing media outlets that are basically propaganda parading as news needs to be a long-term goal. We have to have some basic standards of what constitutes a news outlet and what is a propaganda outlet.
The New Yorker had a piece when there were undecided voters in the 2016 election. And the story was the stewardess asking a passenger, would you like the chicken or the shit embedded with broken glass? And the passenger asked, how is the chicken made? So sometimes it is impenetrable to reach somebody, and then I get back to emotions and narratives and stories.
I really like what you said about narratives, but there's nothing wrong with a few talking points, and I've also been looking for them. And Jim Hightower's Lowdown recently had a nice little thing on the Campaign for America's Future. The 10 talking points: free education, Medicare for all, just like boom, 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 boom. And Progressive Democrats for America has similar lists. I just went online, got some lists. And there's some very nice summaries now. People have been trying to kind of distill it out. Like, what are we... Hightower's thing was, what are progressives for? I had a conversation with a woman about the Second Amendment. She was a relative of a friend of mine. We had this very pleasant visit with her. And just as we were leaving, she says, we've got to be sure we don't they don't take away our gun rights. My friend, we had a very nice time with this lady. Thanks to Tom Hartman, who's really brilliant about the Second Amendment, I could say, well, you know, in Australia they gave up guns, and it really, the crime went way down. She said, really? So anyway, these are good, there are good sources out of it.
Thank you.